And welcome and good morning on this beautiful, beautiful day in San Marcos. I'm delighted to see this diverse gathering of experts and stakeholders here who have come together to look at this most critical topic. I don't have to belabor the point with you that water has been and continues to be such a pressing issue for our state. And we're particularly excited that our university was chosen for the site of this forum because, as all of you know, Texas State has been committed for many, many years to finding solutions for sustaining our state's water resources and the ecosystems that are tied to those water resources. This particular event, of course, is focusing on the Edwards Aquifer. But while we know that virtually all of Texas' water resources are seriously affected by the lingering drought, and just because it rains and the grass gets a little bit greener, we know that that doesn't mean the drought has ended. As you look back on the last several years, Texas has been blessed with good economic health at a time when much of the country has struggled economically. But we all know that our state's economic prospects are tied to the health of our human capital and the health of our natural resources. So it's in everybody's best interest to ensure the viability of both of those. And our water concerns have become more pronounced over the years as we have suffered serious depletion of those resources. I'm confident that with your collective wisdom today, you will guide this forum forward toward fruitful conversation that lead to solutions, difficult as they may be, to this most pressing issue. So thank you again for having this event here. We welcome you on this beautiful day to Texas State University. And I regret that I have to leave. I need to go north to the inauguration ceremony. Believe me, I'd rather be here with you than up in all that traffic that I know I'm going to encounter in Austin. But best wishes for a good forum.
Good morning again. On behalf of the Geography Department, I would like to welcome you and thank you for coming to this event. I would like to thank the people who put these together, and especially Todd Voteler, Robert Gully, Russ Johnson, Andy Sansom, and my associate chair, Ron Egelman, who came up with this idea. And also, I would like to thank everybody at Texas State that made this event possible, and in particular the staff of the Geography Department, and also President Trout for introducing us. Thank you. Next is Andy Sampson, Dr. Andy Sampson.
Thank you, Alberto, and welcome everybody. I'll be very brief. First of all, as Dr. Trout said, water is a core value here at Texas State University. Alberto is very modest in that he should have told you, and I will, that this is the best geography department in the United States. John Hall can tell you that there are more graduates of our geography department working in the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality than from any other university. Water is a major issue for us, and particularly for our geography department. I'm very honored to be associated, as is the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment, with this program today. I'm particularly proud that Todd Voteler and Robert Gully are adjunct members of our geography faculty, and that they have worked together to bring this to our attention. Let me also tell you that I hope that each of you will get Robert's new book, which talks about how the Endangered Species Habitat Conservation Plan was created. As the university's representative for the Habitat Conservation Plan, I can tell you that it is an amazing process and one that is hopefully a model for the rest of the United States. And that book is the very first volume in the Meadows Center and Texas A&M University Press series on conservation leadership, which is sponsored by Ed Cox Jr. and Kathy Cox, two of Texas' most distinguished conservationists. So welcome, and thank you very much for being here today.
All right, well, good morning. My name's Todd Botler. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Texas Water Journal. Welcome to our third Texas Water Journal Forum, The History of the Edwards-Ocker Dispute, A View from the Trenches. This is the first forum that we've done at Texas State, but before we go ahead and start the forum, let me tell you a little bit about the journal. The Texas Water Journal is an online peer-reviewed journal devoted to the timely consideration of Texas water resource management and policy issues from a multidisciplinary perspective that integrates science, engineering, law, planning, other disciplines. It also provides updates on key state legislation and policy changes by Texas administrative agencies. The journal's free, and you can go to texaswaterjournal.org and sign up for it, and you'll get notices when we have new articles. We have other features there, such as the Texas Water Events Calendar. And I've got these little brochures that you may have seen when you come in. It has some more information about the journal and how you can sign up. First of all, let me go ahead and thank Texas State for hosting us today, and President Trouth for allowing us to use this wonderful space. Thank Andy Sampson for the Meadows Center's support for this event and his help getting it organized. And the Department of Geography for all their support and hard work that made this event possible, particularly Dr. Giordano, Dr. Hagelman, Angelica Wall, Pat Hell, Allison Glass-Smith, Katie Alonzo, all the student workers, Gamma, Theta, Upsilon students, and the TSU staff who made the audio and video recording possible. They worked over the weekend and they worked yesterday during a holiday to get everything set up. In addition, Robert Gully and Russ Johnson, who's also an adjunct faculty member in the geography department, both spent many hours over the last several months organizing and shaping today's program. We've got some handouts today. If you have one of these folders, they're all contained in here. If you come up through the table, you're not sitting at one of the tables, there's a chronology and a flyer and also an agenda that will help you to follow along during today's program. If you're tweeting today, and some of us might be, I know I will, because I do that a lot, you might want to use hashtag TXWater, and you can follow the Texas Water Journal on Twitter at TXWaterJournal. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping here. We've got two adjustments to the program. First of all, Panel 2 is going to start at 1:15. Panel 2 is going to start at 1:15 instead of 1:30. And Pete Schinken was unable to join us today. However, Chuck Bailey, who worked for Governor Bullock, Lieutenant Governor Bullock, will be joining Panel 2. Finally, just a note, we've got an excellent lineup of speakers today and panelists. There were many other individuals who really could have made fine additions to the program today, but there's just a practical limit to how many people we can have on the panels. And so we are pleased, though, that the folks that we did invite have traveled from places like Idaho and California and other places to be here today. So now, please help me welcome Dr. Robert Gully, who is going to discuss the background of the Edwards-Ocker dispute leading up to 1989, and that is where Panel 1 will begin their discussion. Robert?
Thank you very much. My job is really a very easy one. I'm not charged, or I'm not going to attempt to try to get in and explain all the details leading up to 1989. What I instead am going to be is a setup man for the first panel, which is the efforts by the Texas Water Commission beginning in 1991 to attempt to resolve the Edwards dispute. And so we'll go fairly quickly, but my goal is to try to give you the background information and really set the evolution of the Edwards aquifer dispute so that you can get a little bit more out of what's going on in the two panels that follow. It's my sense that at the base of the Edwards dispute is the rule of capture. I think the rule of capture really dictated and in many ways played a very important role in this dispute. Under the rule of capture, a landowner is entitled to take as much water as, in general terms, as much water as they can from the aquifer without regard necessarily to the impacts on its neighbors. But in addition, the landowner has no obligation in pumping to protect downstream or surface water rights holders. So it essentially is a system that was in place since after the 1900s, and it essentially was made the operation of the Edwards aquifer unregulated. But beginning in the 1950s and early 1960s, the city of San Antonio got some very stern warnings from the Texas State Water Plan and the United States Commission and others that with the projected growth for the city, that the aquifer was going to be mined significantly and that the San Antonio water supply would be threatened by the year 2000 or 2010. And this resulted in 1952 with the city of San Antonio preparing a master plan, and the master plan called for the city to attempt to become a participant in the GBRA project at the Canyon Dam. This was a project that had been ongoing since the 30s and that it was beginning to progress rather rapidly in the 50s, and it was a deal between GBRA and the Army Corps of Engineers. And so the city, following its master plan, attempted to become a participant in that and to attempt to get 100,000 acre feet from the project. This was opposed by the GBRA that believed that that was a project that had been designed and planned for its basin, and that the basin needed to come first. And this triggered 10 years of fairly contentious litigation, which culminated in a decision by the Texas Supreme Court in 1966 that essentially denied San Antonio participation in the project, and but did say that GBRA was free to sell the water to the city should it choose to do so. The city, in an attempt to protect its water future with growth, began planning for, had other opportunities given to it to develop surface water supplies, which were going to be necessary to protect the water future. These included building dams at Cuero 1 and 2 in 1963, which was a joint project that was developed between GBRA and the San Antonio River Authority, and the Cibolo Reservoir, in which the congressional delegation obtained an appropriation that would allow the creation of a dam and reservoir on the Cibolo Creek and provide water to the city. And then finally it culminated in 1976 when GBRA offered to sell up to 50,000 acre feet of water to the city of San Antonio. Each one of these opportunities was rejected by the city. And the common feature in the rejection was an unwillingness in part of the political people on the city council to make an investment in the future without an imminent threat to their water supply. In some ways, they denied the warnings that they were not going to be able to sustain the growth in the city simply by the use of the groundwater. In addition, there was a sentiment in the city that why should we be investing and surface water supplies and the intended infrastructure when we have this cheap source of water. I think in one case they described it as right outside our window. And as with the failure of the GBRA contract in 1976, the city of San Antonio was basically left without options. As part of the vote that was taken in 1976 on the GBRA contract, which was a 5-4 vote, the then City Councilman Cisneros wanted a call for, with the project being rejected, call for the City Planning Commission to undertake a comprehensive study of providing San Antonio with its water needs. And what was established was what was called the Water Resource Task Force, established in 1977. This was made up of the San Antonio Planning Commission. In addition, it had a citizens advisory group and a technical advisory group to aid it in its work. And this was a very intensive effort. Some of the people in the room, I know Mary Kelly played a very active role in that, as they began to try to map out a different strategy for the city of San Antonio. And in 1979, they came up with 3 recommendations, perhaps 4. But the first was that the city needed to establish a conservation program. The second was it needed to obtain 50,000 acre-feet of water from one of 3 sources, either the Upper Guadalupe River, the Applewhite project, which had been under consideration for a number of years, or the Cibolo project, which had for which an appropriation had been obtained in 1974. And the third recommendation is that there needed to be established some regional conservancy or some regional management in which the Edwards Underground Water District was singled out as a primary candidate. And the final recommendation was that the city continue working with the Edwards Underground Water District to attempt to improve the city's water future. The Edwards is a very critical link in this entire program. It was established in 1959 by the legislature, and quite important to the future. At the time that it was established, it was an elected board with 3 members from each of the counties over the Edwards Aquifer Authority: Uvalde, Medina County, Bexar County, Hays, and Comal counties. Because the rule of capture was the rule in Texas, the Edwards Underground Water District, while it was supposed to conserve and protect the aquifer, was given no real regulatory authority. It had no power to regulate pumping, and therefore, and that lack of any agency with that power became a key issue as things moved forward. The recommendation of the Water Resources Task Force in 1979 was approved by the San Antonio City Council, and at the same time they made the decision and directed the City Water Board to begin developing the Applewhite project, a project which many viewed as not a sound project, and which there was already growing opposition to. And so that was in July of 1979. Continued discussions occurred in the period going forward, but the City Council in 1982 took a slightly different course under Mayor Cisneros. And he asked the City Planning Commission to establish an ad hoc committee, not to just look at a solution for the city of San Antonio, but begin considering a regional approach to managing water resources. The ad hoc committee, again working with a number of the stakeholders and others in the region, recommended a study that would develop alternatives for the for the Edwards Underground Water District and the City of San Antonio to consider in addressing this problem. And that's, as a result of that, the Edwards Underground Water District and the City of San Antonio entered into a memorandum of understanding to go forward with the study. The study was conducted by CH2M Hill beginning in 1984 and completed in 1986. The Edwards Underground Water District and the City of San Antonio developed an implementation advisory task force to help sort through the alternatives, whittle them down a bit, and at the end of that process established a joint committee to begin to try to take those alternatives and come up with a region-wide plan. And that joint committee was made up of 5 members of the San Antonio City Council, headed by Mayor Cisneros, and 1 representative from each of the counties in the Edwards Underground Water District. The first order of business for this joint committee was preparing a resolution. And the resolution was intended to go to the legislature to inform the legislature of what it was doing and to seek legislative support for the initiative. The elements of the resolution included a number of policy statements. The first was that the goal of the regional plan need to make sure that there was no overdrafting of the aquifer during an average rainfall year. The second was that there needed to be established a drought management plan. And the legislature was advised that they would be submitting a drought management plan to be implemented by the Edwards Aquifer Authority. Edwards Underground Water District. Remember, the Edwards Underground Water District had no regulatory authority, and so they were going to the legislature in 1987 to obtain that authority. And then finally, it called for conjunctive use, that is, the management of the aquifer in conjunction with surface water resources, and for the regulation of pumping from the aquifer. The resolution was submitted to the Edwards Underground Water District for approval, and it was approved in 1987. And then I think it's one of the more important events occurred when it was presented to the San Antonio City Council. The San Antonio City Council expressed concern about going forward with the joint committee unless additional representation was given to Bexar County, rather than the Edwards Underground Water District consisting of 3 members from each one of the counties. The City of San Antonio wanted additional representation that more reflected the interests rather than the county boundaries. Tom Fox, who was the general manager of the Edwards Underground Water District at the time, represented to the council that the Edwards Underground Water District was prepared to go forward with looking at a change to the composition of the board, and with that the city council approved the resolution. What happened afterwards was that there was a meeting that took place. It took place in the parking lot of the First State Bank in Uvalde, Governor Briscoe's bank, and in which a deal was struck. And the deal becomes very important in the history. The deal was struck that the composition of the Edwards Underground Water District could indeed be changed, that there would be 6 representatives from from Bexar County, 3 representatives each from the recreational or downstream interests in Comal and Hayes, and 3 representatives each in Medina and Uvalde. Kind of watch this and remember it because it happens again. But that in exchange for that, any county had the right to withdraw from the Edwards Underground Water District. If it could present a petition from 10% of the voters, and that it was supported by the members of the representatives of that particular county in the Edwards Underground Water District. So the composition of the board was going to change in 1989, but the quid pro quo was any county could walk if it could garner the support through a petition process followed by a referendum vote. Okay? And it becomes very critical, and I think probably one of the defining moments in this process. After this agreement was struck, the Joint Committee began to function. Before it did that, it decided that it needed to expand its membership. And it wanted to expand its membership to include the river authorities that would be affected and would probably be involved in the solution. So the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, San Antonio River Authority, and Nueces River Authority were added to the Joint Committee, although they were not voting members. And the deliberations then proceeded over a period of a year. And at the end of the time, as July '88 rolled around, they had reached an agreement on a strategy for a regional water resources plan. Those elements would have had aquifer management, that is, regulations on pumping, conservation, reuse, and surface water projects. And they had also come up with a way to pay for all of these measures. With respect to the management of the aquifer, and I'll call your attention to it because, again, you'll see it a little bit later on. For the management of the aquifer, they established a long-term goal of reducing pumping to 450,000 acre feet. The figure for the 450,000 acre feet was based upon the conclusion that consistent with their resolution that they were going to try to prevent a mining of the aquifer in an average year. 450,000 acre feet was 75% of the average recharge at the time, which was 608,000 acre feet. If you do the math, it comes out about right. So the idea was to keep your pumping, or at least develop a strategy over the long term to keep your pumping at 75% of the average recharge at the time. They were going to reach these goals through three measures. One was voluntary purchases of water rights. The second was retiring water rights as surface projects were brought online. And finally, the creation of a water market that would allow water rights to be purchased or leased. With the management of the aquifer was supposed to be based on historical use. Originally, back when they prepared the resolution, they suggested that irrigated agriculture would their pumping would be based on 2 acre feet per acre of historic use. So that's at least the first place that I was able to find the 2 acre feet popping up into the discussions. But subsequently, in the final plan, that was changed, and they went to a plan that would allow irrigated agriculture to have the acre feet of water necessary to grow crops based upon historical use. While there was a process for allocating that water to irrigated agriculture, a lot of the details were rather vague. Because the projections that they had at the time were that with continued pumping, even at 450,000 acre feet, which remember was supposed to protect the aquifer in an average year, first of all, I'd point out that the calculations were assuming that if you went to 450 and the average recharge was 608 in an average year, that they would be 158,000 acre feet for spring flow, which they deemed to be adequate to protect the species at the springs under average year conditions. But because they realized that even with the 450,000 acre feet, that they were facing severe shortages in the year 2000 and 2010, they developed a very comprehensive conservation plan and added to that a plan for reuse of water that would be over and above 55,000 acre feet, which were going to be left in the river on a historical basis. But the underlying or the underpinning of the entire strategy over the long term was the development of surface water projects. And I went through the litany of what was of the failed opportunities in the 60s and the 70s, but they reappear in the Regional Water Resource Plan. The surface water projects were to be the Applewhite, which, because it had already been proved and was actually fairly well along in the development process, was to be completed by 2000, and then would be followed by Cibolo and Cuero 1 and Cuero 2. The overall surface water projects that would be brought to the table would represent about 245,000 acre feet of water. They didn't concern themselves with the details of drought management. There's some acknowledgement about the need for drought management, but they tended to rely on the drought management plan, which was then under creation by the Edwards Underground Water District, as providing the key to any drought management that was necessary. They had a plan for how they were going to pay for this, and with this, the Joint Committee presented their plan to the public. First of all, the decision to present the plan to the public, or that they were through with their work, was approved by the Joint Committee by a vote of 9-0 with 2 abstentions. Okay? You have 6 members from the city, 5 members from the Edwards Underground Water District, and they voted 9-0 with 2 abstentions. And significantly, or perhaps ominously, those 2 abstentions were from Medina and Uvalde County. The plan was presented to the City Council, and it was passed by a 9-1 vote. It was then presented to the Edwards Underground Water District. And during the interim between the action of the Joint Committee and the creation, tremendous opposition to the plan developed in these 2 counties. The Edwards Underground Water District voted 9-6 to approve the plan. Mayor Cisneros was quoted in the press as saying that this was a decisive victory, but he also admitted at the time that indeed he had heard that both Medina and Uvalde County were planning of backing out of the Edwards Underground Water District. So there may be a little bit of a contradiction in that forecast. The opposition of the western counties was largely based on their belief in the sanctity of the rule of capture. They believed that that water was theirs, and that they weren't tolerant of having that right taken away from them. There were also concerns, I think lesser, although I think we can talk to Luana about that, but I think there were also concerns about why they should be helping to finance the city of San Antonio's water problems. Sure enough, as projected, a referendum was held in Uvalde and Medina counties, and both counties voted overwhelmingly to withdraw from the Edwards Underground Water District. And this was a real blow from a number of reasons, not the least of which was that the notion that the Edwards Underground Water District could be the coalescing point around which a regulatory agency could be developed was somewhat set back when it lost 2 of its members representing a significant part of the aquifer. Despite the withdrawal from the Edwards Underground Water District, and despite the approval by the EUWD and the City Council, they still had to go to the legislature because they didn't have the authority to regulate the aquifer and implement these plans. They went to the legislature in 1989, and the opposition was very strong and vociferous from the western counties, unable to achieve anything that even began to resemble consensus. Nothing happened in 1989 in the legislature with respect to regulation. However, the legislature did create the special committee on the Edwards Aquifer, and that was to be overseen by Senator Cindy Cryer and Representative Paul Terrell. GBRA had been working on the regional water resource plan. They along with the other 2 water authorities had endorsed the plan. They went to the legislature with the city of San Antonio and others in support of the basic structure of the plan, but the incentives without the support in the West, without any legislative action, with a ever unpopular Applewhite project lying at the core of this, the GBRA had no real incentive for continuing along this course. 2 things happened in June of 1989, right after the legislative session, and I think they're also very important from the point of view of what happens next. The first of these was that on June 15th, 1989, GBRA filed a notice of intent to sue under the Endangered Species Act, alleging that Fish and Wildlife Service had failed to do its statutory duty to protect the species. The implications of this decision, first of all, it begins to reflect the somewhat disintegrating coalition that it established, but at the same time, it brought the Endangered Species Act for the first time really into the debate. The second point was it brought the threat of federal intervention into the debate and really changed the dynamic of the considerations as you went along. It also brought the environmental community into the debate as their concerns about the species now were going to be recognized and have to be discussed if there were to be any progress made. The second event also occurred on January 15th, 1989, and that was that GBRA filed suit in Hays County against, I believe, 200 aquifer users, asking for a allocation of water from the Edwards Aquifer on the theory that the Edwards Aquifer was an underground river. The predicate for this action had been established by GBRA in 1988 when they prepared a monograph on why the Edwards Aquifer was properly considered as a underground river. And that suit was filed in Hays County and proceeded over a number of years, and it's actually still pending today, is my understanding. So is 1989, after the legislative session, we saw a real balkanization and a change in the composition of the discussion that was taking place. We had GBRA and the downstream water interests becoming a very distinct group rather than working because they had either threatened or brought suits. We had the city of San Antonio. We had the agricultural community that was absolutely opposed to any management of the aquifer. And we had the environmental interests wanting to protect the endangered species in the spring. There were attempts to resolve the disputes. Some of the attempts initially came in the context of attempts to actually settle the GBRA lawsuit and try to avoid the filing of an Endangered Species Act lawsuit. That one didn't really go anywhere, primarily because of two other things that kind of emerged. One of them was a special committee on the Edwards Aquifer, which began functioning and soon thereafter established a facilitated discussion led by John Folk Williams. That discussion took place over a number of months with absolutely no progress being made. And we can talk a little bit with Weir Labatt and ask him to talk about a little bit of the process that was going on at that time. And then in addition, the Texas Water Commission developed an initiative to try to resolve the dispute. And the initiative was largely led by an individual named John Birdwell. And John Birdwell was one of the commissioners at the time. The other commissioners were involved, but Birdwell took the lead. And as the other two efforts, they were largely, it was largely unsuccessful. He was able to get an emergency drought management plan adopted in the region for 1990. But beyond that, there was no real progress on the long-term solution. Birdwell, I believe, had developed at that time a terminal brain cancer and died in 1991. But I think, and that may have largely affected his ability to move forward. But nonetheless, the three efforts to try to bring this to fruition had all failed. I guess the last event that and I'll try to get us back on schedule here, but the last event occurred in May of 1991. And the Applewhite project was never believed to be a sound project by many. And it was never believed to, and it was a very unpopular project in the San Antonio community, as Carol Patterson will be glad to tell you. The city decided that the city had already authorized construction in 1988. They had spent somewhere between $27 and $40 million already on the project. And they decided to put the project up to a referendum to see about its continued support. In May of 1991, a referendum was held, and the Applewhite was defeated. With the defeat of the Applewhite, with the failure to achieve anything in the regional water plan, with the failure to get anything out of the legislature in 1989, with the division that was already taking place, the failure of the Applewhite was sort of the last straw that signaled that a resolution was not really in the offing. And within about 2 weeks of the filing of the referendum on the Applewhite, the Sierra Club filed its lawsuit, Sierra Club versus Babbitt. That will be the subject of our second panel. But before we get to that second panel, we need to talk a little bit about a second effort that occurred beginning in 1981 and running right up until the trial in November of 1992. And that was an effort by the Texas Water Commission, led by John Hall, to attempt to resolve the lawsuit. He came real close. Ultimately, it failed. But during that time, a lot of discussions took place, and a lot of elements of a plan emerged. And I think as you listen to today to this first panel of people that were on the ground during that time, I think you ought to be aware of the fact that a lot of what happens with John Hall and the Texas Water Commission's plan gets translated into House Bill 1792, which ultimately becomes Senate Bill 1477. So I think that while the overall initiative failed, I think it really survived and really became the basis for Senate Bill 1477. So with that, what I'd like to do is ask the first panel to come up and we'll begin and let them tell you. I've tried to tell you what I think the facts were, but they'll tell you what really happened. Supposedly at 11:45, copies of the book Heads Above Water on the Edwards Aquifer dispute will be available outside for anyone that wants to purchase it. I've not seen it, so I'll be seeing it for the first time when you all do. Let's go back and sort of, recapture where we are. We have a lawsuit being filed by the Sierra Club in 1991. We have a somewhat of a disintegration of efforts to try to resolve the dispute, and we have no regulatory authority that could step in to pick up the slack and begin regulating the aquifer. What I want to do is, in introducing the panel, is to provide you a little bit of background so that you have the facts. There's a chronology in your folder that I think lays out some of the basic facts, and I'd urge you to kind of follow it because it'll provide a little bit more context for the panel discussions. I'll start by telling you at least my view of how the panel ought to operate is I ought to ask one question as a lead-in and then let them talk for an hour and 15 minutes or whatever our time period is and not say another word. But I am prepared, if necessary, to ask questions. But I think this is viewed to be a dialogue. We're not going to have any presentations. What we want to do is create an oral history, and we've invited the people that really were in the trenches during that time period, both on this panel and the second panel. So, as I said earlier, the Texas Water Commission is the lead player in the next chapter in the saga of the dispute. Governor Richards was elected in 1990, took office in 1991, and in May of that year, she appointed John Hall. John, you all can acknowledge yourself and as to the Texas Water Commission, and a month later made him the chairman of the commission. In September of 1991, best I can tell is one of his first initiatives that he undertook, he decided that he was going to pick up the challenge of trying to resolve the Edwards Aquifer dispute. At that time, he announced to the stakeholders that he was prepared to allow the stakeholders until February 5th of the next year to come up with a solution, and if they were unable to do so, then the Texas Water Commission would act. Immediately upon that occurring, some of the stakeholders in the region retained the services of Bruce Todd, who is the mayor of the city of Austin, to begin facilitated discussions to see if they could come up with a solution by the February 5th deadline. They were unsuccessful. On or about May 5th, John Hall announced that Texas Water Commission was going to take the lead in developing a plan, and shortly thereafter issued a white paper, sort of laying out the structure of what the Texas Water Commission might do in terms of a plan. And then encouraged further discussions to take place, setting sort of a April 15th deadline for getting it resolved. At that point, and working with Selena Romero, who was the counsel for the Texas Water Commission at the time, with no deal to be presented, the Texas Water Commission acted. And what they did was they declared that they had jurisdiction over the aquifer because the aquifer was an underground river. This caught a lot of people by surprise. And one of the things I think we want to talk about was whether they anticipated it and how much of a surprise it was for them. But then became the process of working with the stakeholders to see, despite their action, that whether a solution could be reached. The city of San Antonio, along with almost all of the stakeholders, opposed the notion that this was an underground river, but was willing to have discussions with, or at least the city of San Antonio was willing to have discussions with John to see if a plan could be developed for going forward to perhaps in the next legislative session with a scheme by which the aquifer could be regulated. This deal was struck with the city of San Antonio in June of 1992. At that time, there were continued efforts to try to forge a solution with the other stakeholders, and also in addition, Fish and Wildlife Service Region 2 became involved in the process, trying to help talk about the plan and and whether it was going to be sufficient to solve the Endangered Species Act problems. And the regional administrator for Region 2 at the time was Mike Spear, and he was involved in a number of the discussions both earlier in the year and in August of '92 with regard to the merits of the plan from the perspective of the Endangered Species Act. These discussions, the plan that was structured with the city of San Antonio was not popular. It was opposed by the environmental community. It was opposed by GBRA, and it was strongly opposed by irrigated agriculture. And Luana Buckner, who was only 6 years old at the time, Luana Buckner participated in a lot of those discussions, and will be here today to talk a little bit about the feelings of the irrigated agricultural community, their attitudes and their approach to the problems. Weir Labatt, who was on the city council and who was the city's point person from about 1987 until 1982, will talk a little bit about or was here to represent some of the discussions that were taking place leading up to the Underground River Declaration, and but was not actually a participant in the discussions with the city of San Antonio. Finally, a hearing was held in September, and this picture will flash across the screen of a very motley group of people. Robert Puente was there, Weir Labatt, and Nelson Wolf. The hearing was held on the Underground River determination, and the Texas Water Commission agreed to go forward. It was immediately heard by a court in Austin, which declared it to be unlawful. We'll talk a little bit about that decision, about the appellate process, and we'll also talk a little bit about what happened next, because immediately Representative Puente and I believe working with Chairman Hall, began to take the elements that the Water Commission had gone forward and we tried to work that into legislation. And at least it's my belief that that legislation, which was introduced as House Bill 1792, ultimately formed the backbone of Senate Bill 1477, which created the Edwards Aquifer Authority. But the place I think we need to start is with John Specht. John was the general manager of GBRA since the early 70s, been with GBRA since 1965 until he left GBRA in 1994. John was sort of present at all the things we've talked about already, and present at certainly as this process moved forward with John Hall and as it moved into the litigation. And what I'd like to do is start out by inviting John to comment a little bit about the overall strategies that GBRA had in its dealings with the city of San Antonio during the 70s, during the 80s as we get to the regional water plan, and what was the thinking of GBRA as it sort of moved from working, or at least trying to work with the other parties, to more of a litigation posture. So maybe that's a good way to kick it off, and then we can let other people jump in and talk about that.
Well, we can start that way and indeed get the controversy started again.
That's the reason we have him here. We have Weir over there.
Can you hear me fairly well, or do I need to get closer? I think the thing that you need to bear in mind on this whole issue is this thing started with the drought of the 50s, a very severe drought which resulted in the Comal Springs, San Marcos Springs being severely depleted, the Guadalupe River and other rivers to be sure, but the Guadalupe River was essentially dry until well below Seguin. And that issue weighed very heavily on the GBRA board, of course, and many other people in the region. And part of that was alluded to earlier by Robert. But I think it's important to realize that as a result of that, the Canyon Reservoir was actually filled, so it became functional in 1964. From that point on, there was of course, the development of the creation of the Edwards Underground Aquifer Authority, and that was really pushed because people were concerned about spring flow, particularly. There began to be some concern in San Antonio about the future and resources that were necessary to carry the city on into the next century, but there was essentially nothing being done other than some studying of the aquifer. It was very helpful, very informative. It's the first time we began to really understand the source of the water that flows into the aquifer and how the aquifer itself acts. Going from that point then, the River Authority, with a fairly substantial supply of water, surface water in Canyon Reservoir, needed to go ahead and put that water to work as rapidly as possible because it's very expensive to construct reservoirs like that. The GBRA was responsible for the costs related to the water supply in the aquifer. And about that time, when the aquifer was completed, we were going through a rather painful process of having competing permit applications before the Texas Water Commission. GBRA was asking for 50,000 acre feet, which was judged to be the yield of the aquifer when considering all downstream water rights. The city of San Antonio, based on their consulting engineers' hydrology, called for the permit and asked for 100,000 acre feet of water. And essentially, the way that number came about was ignoring downstream water rights. And indeed, there is that additional water there when you just throw out any consideration of the downstream water rights interests. That went all the way through the Texas Supreme Court and ultimately was decided in favor of GBRA, and they were awarded 50,000 acre feet of water from Canyon Reservoir for municipal uses primarily. That decision did not preclude passing water, surface water, to other users, such as San Antonio as a possibility. It was interesting then that in the succeeding years, as the concerns and the discussion over what to do about the Edwards Aquifer and some effort to find a solution to the regionals, the area's water supply needs. But the effort kind of came to a head in the early 70s when GBRA and the city of San Antonio got together in supposedly very serious talks about getting some water from Canyon Reservoir over to the city of San Antonio to begin to meet some of their long-term needs. That was a long and painful contract negotiation. We finally worked it out. The essence of it was that San Antonio would receive initially 30,000 acre feet, subsequently would receive an additional 20,000 acre feet from the reservoir storage when the next major reservoir in the Guadalupe River Basin was completed, in order to continue to maintain a good water supply for the people in the Guadalupe River Basin, as well as beginning to supply some of the needs of San Antonio. Unfortunately, that failed. The city council voted, and I think you referenced it, Robert, on a 5-4 vote, something like that, with Mayor Cisneros essentially casting the final vote against it, and thereby killing that effort. That didn't lead to good relations between the River Authority and the city of San Antonio and other interests in the area. Very painful. Subsequent to that, then, there was a substantial effort in a series of major studies, regional studies, to determine what water supply could be developed in the Guadalupe River Basin, surface water, to supplement San Antonio and other users, to be sure. And that series of studies, which are well documented in great detail, always involving the major players here: the city of San Antonio, the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, the San Antonio River Authority, the Nueces River Authority, and the Edwards Underground Water District, of course. And I think were very helpful. But the city of San Antonio, in the final analysis, was not willing to agree to anything that limited their use of the aquifer. That was off-stated by mayors, by various other individuals involved. And then finally getting to that major study that you referred to, and I forget the exact terminology.
Regional water resources.
Regional water resource study. Anyway, that was a very interesting proceeding there, because all of the major political figures were there, actively participating. The major entities were there, either directly at the table or as resources, and commenting as this progressed. And it was, I think, was very helpful, except in the final analysis, it culminated in no further movement. It's always interesting to think about the various personalities that participated in those things and the comments that came out, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But one of the aspects of that came from that effort was an effort, and you've again referred to the committee that was pulled together, again, all the major players being there, in an effort to draft a proposed legislative act which would create or reinvent, so to speak, the Edwards Underground Water District into a new entity with regulatory powers and a lot of other detail to go with it. That bill was drafted by Roger Nivola, who was the GBRA's attorney at that time and working on the on this issue, which had been going on ever since the creation of Canyon Reservoir and coming forward. That effort came to naught also. The bill was drafted. It was carried to the legislature, and I remember very well at the time that Cindy Cryer, who was a senator at the time from Bexar County, in a hearing, asked me point blank, "Would you? What does GBRA want to do here? Are you going to pursue some effort in the courts, or are you going to support this this draft bill which we have developed?" And I told her, we're going to support that bill. If you can pass that bill, then we can go forward, and we have no need for any further court actions, and we'll begin to have some kind of a regional plan to work on with an entity that has some regulatory power to put it into place. Well, it failed significantly because of the opposition by the Medina, Uvalde County people that had irrigation interests, but also because there was not all that much support from the San Antonio our delegation to the House and Senate. If there was support, it was pretty lukewarm, and so the issue just didn't make it. And then with that, then GBRA was left with the effort to force the issue in some way, and that's when Roger and I came up with the strategy of first filing a lawsuit in Hays County claiming that the aquifer was an underground stream or an underground river. That was bolstered by this little report, and it was also referred to by Robert, that we developed, which laid out the details of the hydrology of the aquifer, the interrelation with the surface water in the three river basins, and that I think was really fairly well done, although it was very much resented by those that were on the other side of the issue. And in this, we also suggested what the solution might be, and that is the development of additional surface water reservoirs to supply surface water to supplement the share of the aquifer that was going to be used by San Antonio, the share that was to be used by other entities, by the irrigators to the west. But it only served as a basis for the River Authority essentially then going forward. Simultaneously with the filing of that underground stream in the courts in Hays County, we also gave notice to under the Endangered Species Act of wanting to go forward and claiming that the threatened and endangered species in the aquifer needed protection. And so that kind of brings you to the point of, well, why was GBRA doing this? What was the purpose here? Well, it was again multi-purpose. For one thing, we had to do something because we were again facing a dry period about that time, and we needed to find some way to gain reasonable regulation of the aquifer among the users. That was really the main purpose. Secondly, while all this was going on over this period of years, nobody, including all of the communities, city of San Antonio, and everybody else involved, people downstream, nobody would do anything because they didn't see any reason why, as long as the aquifer had all that water in it, they were just fine. Just fine. No reason to do anything. And that was based on, first of all, costs. People didn't want to have to spend money for a supplemental supply of water when they had a relatively inexpensive supply of water from the aquifer. Secondly, there was a lot of misinformation that was passed around, hydrologic misinformation about what the aquifer actually contained, how broadly it could be used, how far it would go during periods of major drought. And that was very frustrating to see that kind of thing. And it was, of course, fostered by some misinformation from consulting engineers, and then coming further, repeated by those in various political offices in all the communities.
John, let me interrupt you there because I think you've laid a lot out on the table. And let me start by asking where you were back representing the city during that time period, and give you an opportunity to respond, and then I'll ask Luana to respond.
I don't think I'm going to start by responding per se, but I'd like to just, for you all, and many of you all participated in this debate over that period of time, but I think from when I got involved in 1987, representing the city with the committee that was set up to deal with the Edwards Underground Water District, it was a very contentious issue from the very, very start. And it probably goes back, John, but even before then, like you were talking
yes.
about, back into the vote of the city council in 1976 on canyon water. But you had some forces there that, looking back on it, there was never going to be a decision reached, because you had irrigated agriculture that really believed in the rule of capture, and they really didn't want any change. I think that's a fair way to put it. The city of San Antonio had a cheap source of water, and there was really no will to go out and get additional sources or to do anything. And I always felt like the city was sort of in the middle and being tugged both directions all the time. One wanting to do something for the rule of capture, maybe a small attempt to get additional water. I thought about getting additional water, but then you got into the cost issue, and it was going to cost a whole lot of money. And then you had the downstream interest and the spring interest that felt that there should be maintain a continuous flow at San Marcos and Comal Springs, and downstream interest that needed water as a stakeholder group. And so you had these three forces out there that really, there was no level of trust to speak of at all, for a lot of reasons. And so we started negotiating, and when Robert asked me to be on this panel, my main thought was that I can't remember all the meetings that I went to. It seemed like I just went from one meeting to the next, and there was a new plan, one plan after the other. And at least in the city of San Antonio, there was nobody that really wanted to deal with a water issue. It was a mean issue that nobody wanted to deal with, and there were just a few of us. I was probably the only elected official. It was crazy enough to be in the middle of it. And I'd go back to council, and I'd get okays to do things, but it was sort of a lukewarm okay. They say, what in the world is Labatt doing today? And even the lawyers that represented the city were always sort of aghast at, did he really say that in these meetings? Because we were just trying anything to create some kind of resolution to it. And it wasn't going to happen. It just wasn't going to happen. And so all this history that goes on and all these meetings and all these different committees and all the lack of trust that was there was really pretty phenomenal. And it just sort of, you know, when we look at Robert's book or we hear John talking about some of the history, it's it was just one thing after the next, one iteration of trying to solve the problem after the next, none of which we're going to go forth. And I'm going to ask John a question real quick. I mean, this is not bringing up old things, but I think it was 1991 that we were trying to draft that legislation. And we didn't have irrigated agriculture at the table with us. They were completely opposed to what we were attempting to do, which was some kind of regulation of the Edwards. And we were sitting in a meeting in Austin trying to draft this thing, and Roger Navola he was the author of the bill, and every time we'd come up with a suggested change, it would go back to Roger, and he'd redraft the complete bill. And it'd come back to us, and it wouldn't look anything like the same. And so I'm even surprised we got anything that went to the legislature at all, because it was such a convoluted process. But I'll never forget, every time we'd get to a meeting, we'd come back with a new draft that looked completely different than the one before. I don't even remember that, John. But my question to you is, were you really intending to file the lawsuit, the intent the notice of intent to file a lawsuit, because you realized we probably weren't going to get anywhere?
Well, you know, again, I'm getting a little wordy here, but really it's very significant to this whole issue. And that is, as we realized that it was going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, and I certainly agree with that, to get anything done, then also we had to look at what process, and we've mentioned the filings in the courts. But also with that came the realization, Guadalupe Blanco River Authority is a political subdivision of the state, although it operates as other river authorities rather independently, both financially and otherwise, with the guidance of its board of directors. But if you think about it, under an issue that appeared to have no solution, how was the river authority, a small political subdivision, going to compete and have enough money to carry through some of these things to any kind of solution through the courts? The cost is tremendous, as many of you are very familiar. And we couldn't. There was just no way. In fact, it was even commented on the talk radio shows in San Antonio at the time. I think it was in discussion with Joe Aceves, who was the SAWS manager at that time. And the talk show host said, well, can't you just outspend them, referring to GBRA? And Joe said, well, I suppose we can. He didn't have a good word, but that was a major problem. How do you carry this forward?
Well, John, I thought you were always trying to sabotage our efforts to create legislation in 1991. I don't know if that's true or not.
No,
it doesn't.
No, quite to the contrary. We were, you were referring to Roger Navola. Our effort was to create something that we could get through the legislature and get away from all this issue, and have a solution that would work, a regulatory agency taking the place of the old Edwards Underground Water District. So that was our problem, and that's interesting because, again, referring to these lawsuits, it was at that point in time that Roger and I, in discussion, said the River Authority is going to have a tough time carrying this all the way through to its end over a period of time, long period of time, and so we better find some help. And that's when Roger went over and talked with Stuart Henry, who you'll get to visit with a little later today, and we agreed that the Sierra Club, Stuart, would participate and indeed lend its name to the court proceedings under the Endangered Species Act. So that's how this all evolved, because we indeed, as Weir said, we were at a point that there was just no way that we were going to get a solution and agree among the parties. So we had to find some other way to force this issue to get something done. And there too, a comment that I made to Robert earlier in that meeting, and Weir, you may have been there, but former Mayor Lila Cockrell was there. Everybody was pretty frustrated, and she finally stood up, and we had at that time, by that time, filed these suits in intent to sue under the Endangered Species Act. And she looked at me and she said, "Why have you sued us?" And I was kind of taken aback. I didn't quite know what to say. And finally I said, "Because, Mayor, you won't do anything." And that was essentially where we were just stuck. And Mary Kelly was there, a leading player at the time. Mary, do you remember some of those meetings, and maybe you even remember Mayor Cockrell's comments?
I do, and I remember all the controversy that everyone is discussing today, as all ballot people were well-meaning, well-intentioned, carrying forward what they believe were the positions of their constituents, groups they represented, and it was complicated. So every one of these meetings you mentioned, and we mentioned, move things forward maybe just a little bit, but over a period of time, it gradually did result in a good resolution. Can't wait for the afternoon.
Before I bring Luann into the conversation, the Regional Water Resource Plan represented somewhat of a departure for the city, which had long advocated for the rule of capture. Do you have any insight or comment on what was behind that evolution? And it was certainly pre-Catfish Farm.
I think we realized we needed to make some changes in just believing in the rule of capture. And so we agreed to conservation, we agreed to some drought management, we agreed to additional water resources. And in that plan, the Applewhite Reservoir became part of that plan. It was just one of a number of different parts of the solution. So I think the city really did move quite a bit in that, but at least in terms of what GBRA thought, it wasn't enough, because looking at it, it didn't really guarantee spring flow, and that is one of the elements that was needed. And then after the plan was approved, Robert, we got stuck pretty much on one issue, and that was Applewhite. And we devoted all of our energy towards moving forward on Applewhite. And if you remember, we passed that in 1989, and it went under construction, and 2.5 years went by, and $40 million were spent on the Applewhite project. And then we received the signatures from the voters. And the vote was taken in 1991. Carol will be unhappy if I say this, but it's probably, but this is all history now, and there are no hard feelings about any of this, because we've come a long way towards creating a trust level between all the different stakeholders. And I say that to Carol, and I say that to John Specht, and a whole lot of people. There's a trust level now that there wasn't back then. But as a city councilman, what we should have done as a city is reject those petitions, because we'd already issued contracts. We'd been under construction for 2.5 years and spent $40 million. We should have rejected, and Frank Wing advocated that. And I went to the committee that was supporting Applewhite, headed by Bill Greehey, called Water Now, if you remember that. And he just said, no, we're going to have a vote, and we're going to win the vote. And we went ahead and the city council approved putting that on a ballot. And if we hadn't put it on the ballot, which I think would have been the correct, Frank Wing was correct on that, it would have probably been political suicide for all of those that voted not to have the voters vote on it. But in the form of a representative form of government, we should not have put it on the ballot at that time. It was a bad decision to do that. It was a good political decision on one hand, and a bad policy decision on the other.
Let me try to get Luann into this, and so you've got a lot of things you can answer, beginning with the assertion about the position of the irrigated agriculture during this period before John gets involved.
Sure. Well, let me start out by saying both times when the Applewhite project got voted down, Medina County just cheered. It's like, yes, they can't even begin to resolve their own problems, and they want to drag us into it with them. Let me point out there are a number of current and former directors of the Edwards Aquifer Authority here. I'm not going to introduce you, but raise your hand so people know who you are. And we do have several staff members, our general manager, general counsel, a couple over here. Y'all raise your hands. I am speaking on behalf of myself and not the board of directors of the Edwards, speaking mainly as my former position of general manager of the Medina County Groundwater Conservation District. And the only reason I was in the room so much is because my former boss, who's the big players in Medina County and all of this controversy have all passed. And my former boss, Oliver Martin, who was the key negotiator for Medina County, did not like to drive in Austin. And so therefore I was along. I've got memories of being in some representative or senator's office in the Capitol, and we walk in, well, we're here to talk about Edwards, and right after us comes Weir Labatt and some other council members, and apparently they say, we're here to talk about the Edwards, so they put us all in the room together. We're like, no, we're not here to talk to them. But those are some of the good memories. Medina County was willing to fight tooth and nail to defend the right to capture. There was also a huge sentiment in Medina County, and maybe surprisingly to some of you here, still to some degree, people in Medina County wanted to fight the Endangered Species Act. This is 20 years ago. Russ can correct me later if I'm misstating it, but there had not been a whole lot of litigation over the Endangered Species Act, and I think the people in Medina County just felt real strongly, maybe naively, that the federal government wasn't going to take away this right, in favor of some species that we would argue you can put in an aquarium and they'll be just fine. So I think those were the two major issues. When we began seriously negotiating 1477, it was with Russ Johnson and Joe Aceves and Chuck Bailey, we were literally put in a room and told not to leave until we came up with some decisions. And in irrigated agriculture did get a lot of concessions in that bill. We got the 2 acre feet. We finally, I remember it was a major breakthrough when the Western interest finally agreed to having meters put on their irrigation wells, but the conditions were that they had to be paid for, and later it was added that they had to be maintained by this new authority. The makeup of the board was a big battle, and the concessions were made that it should be composed of these regional interest groups, agriculture, Spring Flow, and San Antonio. Just to summarize, those were the two, or maybe the three biggest issues, I think, for people in Medina County was don't give up this right to capture, don't agree to put these limits on ourselves to protect these endangered species, go after the act, go after the federal government. Sounds like Texas, doesn't it? and the makeup of the board. Those were our big issues.
Luana, particularly after John Hall gets involved, there appears to be at least differences in the flexibility between Medina and Uvalde County. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe tell us what the basis for that is?
Well, I can't speak, Vic Hildebrand's here, he can speak for Uvalde County. There's always been differences between Medina and Uvalde. I think part of that has to do with, I think 75% of the people that live in Castroville work in San Antonio, and so there's that, communities of interest, if you want to call it that, between at least the eastern part of Medina County and Bexar County. Uvalde's a little further removed. Uvalde's biggest argument maybe not their biggest, but one of their arguments, and I think a valid argument, was that their pumping didn't really affect spring flow, given the distance between the two. And, they are, bless their hearts, they've been in stage 5 for a year and a half now at a 44% reduction in pumping. So, you got to